Awesome. So this week we're going to be starting a new unit, and within this unit we're going to be talking about the United States involvement in World War I. So throughout the unit we'll talk about topics such as how the United States got into the war, we'll talk about the origins of World War I, the Woodrow Wilson presidency, how the United States got involved in World War I, what our involvement was throughout the war, and we'll eventually get to the end of World War I and transition a little bit into World War II, but we'll talk about that later on. So to begin the unit and today's lesson, we're going to be talking about what our objectives are. So I'll go ahead and read those. Students will be able to explain the global impact of World War I. So by the end of this lesson, I want you guys to be able to understand how World War I impacted countries across the globe, mainly in Europe and in the United States, obviously. But I want you guys to be able to understand what particular impacts the World War I had on those particular countries in Europe and the United States. Our next objective is students will be able to analyze the importance of the Woodrow Wilson presidency for the United States during World War I. Woodrow Wilson was very particular about how he went about things during his presidency, and we'll dive deeper into that later on in the lesson today. So our essential questions are: who were the countries involved in the Central and Allied powers during World War I? Our next question is, what caused Woodrow Wilson to refrain from the U.S. entering World War I? Again, we'll get into that later today. And what country is blamed for the start of World War I? Okay, so now that we've gone through those, I have a pre-test for you guys. So what I mean by pre-test is it's not for a grade. I know the word test scares you guys a little bit. It's not for a grade though. So what it is it's 10 questions and it's over to the entire unit. So obviously it may be some questions that you guys may not know or topics that you may not understand yet, but it's just for me to be able to gauge where you guys are at, what your understanding is of the topics that we're going to be talking about. And by getting that information, I can see, where I need to take more detail into it, or maybe where I can go a little bit faster. But it's just 10 questions. It's just something that I want to be able to see where you guys are at, what your knowledge base is, and just to see, how much you guys know already. So I'm going to give you guys a little bit of time to go ahead and go through that. Again, it's pretty short. It shouldn't take you too long, but I just want to see where you guys are at. So I'll give you guys a little bit of time to go through that. Awesome. So now that you guys have done the pretest, we're going to go ahead and talk about the bell ringer for today's class. So I had this up while you guys were walking into class today. You should have taken a look at it and maybe scribbled down some answers when you got to your seat. So the bell ringer for today was, if war broke out while you were president of the United States, how would you react? I'll read that again. If war broke out while you were president of the United States, how would you react? So I wanted you guys to write your answers at the top of your page in your notebook above where your notes will begin for today. So that way when I go through your notes, we'll be able to see, that you guys did the bell ringer, what your answers were. Is there anybody that wants to share their answer now? Anybody? No? That's okay. We're going to come back to it in a little bit. I just wanted to see if anybody wanted to share their answers and get you guys thinking about the particular topics that we're going to be talking about today. So as I mentioned, the topics that we're going to be talking about today is the origins of World War I and the Woodrow Wilson presidency. So let's go ahead and get into it. So how everything began. Everything began by the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. However, this isn't the main consideration. It is one of the main causes of World War I. There are some build-up causes that we'll talk about here in a little bit, but this is considered the climax for the cause of World War I. So there was a Serbian group called the Black Hand, led by Gavrilo Princip, and a group of 6 others who were looking to end the Austrian-Hungarian rule in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So what they did is, they assassinated the Archduke in order to end that kind of rule and kind of set a tone. However, what happened because of this is the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, pledged war against Serbia. And with that happening, Serbia, and I've got a map for us to be able to take a look into this later, is Serbia is a very much smaller country than what the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was at this particular time. And so at that point, you had your already pre-built alliances, which we'll talk about here in a second, that went ahead and started building the shape of what those main alliances would be in World War I. So because of this particular assassination, you already go ahead and see these alliances being formed, sides being taken, and what eventually ends up causing World War I in 1914. So let's get into it. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is, like I mentioned before, there were some build-up causes into World War I. We call them the main causes, and you'll see why in the video. So I have a quick video that we're going to be able to watch real quick. Go ahead and get that going for you guys.
Possibly the single most pondered question in history. What caused the unbound, senseless slaughter that was the First World War? It wasn't, like in World War II, a case of a single belligerent pushing others to take a military stand. It didn't have the moral vindication of resisting a tyrant. Rather, a delicate but toxic balance of structural forces created a dry tinder that was lit by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. That event precipitated the July Crisis, which saw the major European powers hurtle toward open conflict. The MAIN acronym is often used to analyze the war. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. It's simplistic, but provides a useful...
So I'm going to pause the video there real quick. Do any of you guys have any ideas of what these four topics could mean in the buildup of, World War I, what we're talking about today? Does anybody have any idea? No? Nobody has any idea. Okay, that's perfectly fine. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue to watch the video, and maybe we'll learn a little bit about how these four particular topics sparked World War I.
Framework. The late 19th century was an era of military competition, particularly between the major European powers. The policy of building a stronger military was judged relative to neighbors, creating a culture of paranoia that heightened the search for alliances. It was fed by the cultural belief that war is good for nations. Germany in particular looked to expand its navy. However, the naval race was never a real contest. The British always maintained naval superiority. But the British obsession with naval dominance was strong. Government rhetoric exaggerated military expansionism. A simple naivety in the potential scale and bloodshed of a European war prevented several governments from checking their aggression. A web of alliances developed in Europe between 1870 and 1914, effectively creating two camps bound by commitments to maintain sovereignty or intervene militarily. The Triple Alliance of 1882 linked Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The Triple Entente of 1907 linked France, Britain, and Russia. A historic point of conflict between Austria-Hungary and Russia was over their incompatible Balkan interests, and France had a deep suspicion of Germany, rooted in their defeat in the 1870 war. The alliance system primarily came about because, after 1870, Germany, under Bismarck, set a precedent by playing its neighbors' imperial endeavors off one another in order to maintain a balance of power within Europe. Imperial competition also pushed the countries towards adopting alliances. Colonies were units of exchange that could be bargained without significantly affecting the metropole. They also brought nations who would otherwise not interact into conflict and agreement. For example, the Russo-Japanese War, 1905, over aspirations in China, helped bring the Triple Entente into being. It has been suggested that Germany was motivated by imperial ambitions to invade Belgium and France. Certainly the expansion of the British and French empires, fired by the rise of industrialism and the pursuit of new markets, caused some resentment in Germany, and the pursuit of a short, aborted imperial policy in the late 19th century. However, the suggestion that Germany wanted to create a European empire in 1914 is not supported by the pre-war rhetoric and strategy. Nationalism was also a new and powerful source of tension in Europe. It was tied to militarism and clashed with the interests of the imperial powers in Europe. Nationalism created new areas of interest over which nations could compete. For example, the Habsburg Empire was a tottering agglomeration of 11 different nationalities, with large Slavic populations in Galicia and the Balkans, whose nationalist aspirations ran counter to imperial cohesion. Nationalism in the Balkans also piqued Russia's historic interest in the region. Indeed, Serbian nationalism created the trigger cause of the conflict, the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Okay, so now that we've discussed and watched the video about the four main causes, do you guys kind of have a better idea of how the four main causes, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, all played a role into the build-up of World War I? So again, we'll kind of go over them just a little bit. Militarism, which is the ability of nations to, create an army, have a military strength, and kind of build that intimidating presence amongst countries across the globe. Alliances, like we have already mentioned, you've got, teams, or not teams, but you've got countries building sides in a particular, already in the globe. You've got Germany going against Britain already in naval recognition, things like that, which, build conflict. Countries want to be the best in almost every aspect over other ones. So, that's a main threat to other countries. You've got imperialism, which is, expanding. Countries want to expand. They want more territory, more wealth, more resources. And that kind of, that's a major conflict amongst countries even today. You've got countries that want, certain resources and certain aspects of territory that, causes conflict. And you've got nationalism, which is pride in your country. You've got people that are willing to fight, people that are willing to, sacrifice their privileges for their country. And that's a very powerful tool and a very scary tool if used in the wrong context. All right, so next you've got the alliances of World War I. So the video that we just watched kind of explained to them a little bit. So you have the Central Powers and the Allied Powers. So the Central Powers are Austria-Hungary, which is who was assassinated from? Who was assassinated that we talked about already today? That's right, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So Franz Ferdinand was, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. So then you've got Germany, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, which now today is Turkey. And then on the other side, you've got Great Britain, France, Russia, which are three main superpowers at this moment in time. Great Britain has, one of the strongest navies in the world. France, Russia, both are very strong military with very strong military power and military might. And then eventually you'll have the United States join. We do join later in the war, and we'll talk about that later on, why that happens and why the United States joins late. So here we have a map, and the reason I put this in here is I wanted to talk to you guys about what the location and size of the particular countries mean. So here you have Russia, right? Everybody knows Russia. It's giant. It's absolutely massive, right? So then here you have Germany. You have Austria-Hungary down below it. Bulgaria is right here. And then you've got the Ottoman Empire down here. So that is the main central powers. But if you look at it, Austria-Hungary's here. What's right here? Serbia, right? So we have Serbia, and that's the beginning of World War I. Austria-Hungary, after the Serbian nationalists killed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, pledged war on Serbia. And you can just take a look at it. Austria-Hungary is probably twice the size of Serbia in just pure land. We don't even know about military might. But at this point, Austria-Hungary was very strong in military power, and they were one of the strongest in the world. So you can see why you have countries such as France, Great Britain, Russia, that, want to help this country. They don't want, an already superpower in the world, Austria-Hungary, to be able to just kind of run through Serbia. And that plays a key role. So another thing that plays a key role is just the location of these places. So if Germany and Austria-Hungary are central in Europe, you've got Russia, France, and Great Britain that have a massive advantage in terms of military tactics. And that'll play a major role in the war and throughout the war and what these countries decide to do. And I wanted you guys to be able to see that because it does play a major factor in, the beginning of the war and how the war gets going. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is the presidential election of 1912. And the reason we're going to talk about this is because you have the Democratic president nominee, Woodrow Wilson, and then you have the Republican nominee, William Howard Taft, he was incredibly well known at the time and very much, almost a favorite. And then you had the current president, Theodore Roosevelt, running. At this time, they were all three from different parties. I believe one of them was a progressive party. I want to say Theodore Roosevelt was. And during that time, this was very welcomed. So Roosevelt was trying to run for a second term. Then you have a Republican nominee, and then you have your Democratic nominee, Woodrow Wilson. Now, Woodrow Wilson wins, claiming 435 of the 531 electoral votes. Now, Woodrow Wilson's main program that he was running was called New Freedom. He wanted to be able to try and get rid of government corruption. He wanted to make sure that government was respecting the individual freedoms, especially ones of like the First Amendment, where you have freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion, things like that. But he also promised very much like a ton of reforms. He wanted to, increase banking, fix foreign tariffs on goods, so that way the United States is able to bring in more money for what we're able to put out. And he had a bunch of business reforms that would help the industrial business be able to boom and progress. Wilson's first term, like I said, as I mentioned, was called a progressive movement. He was trying to help the negative effects of industrialization and, just kind of help the economy in a bigger way than what anybody prior to him had seen. Another fun fact is that Woodrow Wilson is actually the second Democratic president since the Civil War in this time period. So he's actually fairly new. We haven't had a Democratic president since, he's one of two since the Civil War. And, that's pretty interesting. It's pretty different. It's unique. And he brings a different kind of dynamic to the country during this time. However, his first term is kind of overseen by some negative lights. He was known for some racial divides across government. He was very adamant of a KKK member and things like that, which it hurts him when he tries to run for a second term. And we'll talk about that in a second. But those kind of things in a country very much that needs an identity, needs kind of this pending, reputation, it hurts his presidency, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the presidential election of 1916, which is where the Democratic nominee, again, Woodrow Wilson, he's running for his second term, goes against the Republican nominee, Charles Evan Hughes. So we talked about how Woodrow Wilson's first term, he used, this term of new freedom, and he was a progressive movement. He was trying to, make the economy boom and help these industrialization effects. Well, this one was completely different. So he had the war going on in Europe, in which everybody was aware of. You also had the Mexican Revolution. And so his slogan for this term was, "He kept us out of war." And we'll talk about that more in a second. He was very neutral, and he was very much able to appease the public opinion in how the United States foreign affairs were. He was very reluctant because of, our passive wars and things like that. And he very much narrowly wins this. And it was close. Charles Evan Hughes was so close to beating him. However, Woodrow Wilson came out on top, and we have him for a second term, and he is our president throughout World War I, and we'll talk about that and what his particular viewpoints were, what the public viewpoints were, and things like that. So, as I mentioned, Woodrow Wilson had a policy of neutrality. So, what do we mean by neutrality? Does anybody know? Exactly. It means that you kind of stay in the middle. You're the middleman. You don't pick one side, you don't pick the other. In this case, the public opinion in the United States was that we did not want to join World War I. Whether this be because of our past relationship in wars and how many losses we've had, and just the kind of the economic impact and things like that, we don't really know. However, the public opinion was that we wanted to stay out of it. We wanted to stay neutral. we did not want to be a part of the war. And President Woodrow Wilson was favored to that. He didn't want to join unless he had to, unless he was forced to. However, he was not completely neutral. So what I mean by that, and you can see it in this picture that I have here, this right here, we all know Uncle Sam, right? However, this is mentioned, excuse me, the illustration is by Dr. Seuss. You can see that this says the aid that will win, right? And this is the Neutrality Act. So although the United States is remaining neutral, we were giving aid in terms of, munitions, money. We weren't sending soldiers over because that, again, takes us out of neutrality, but we were giving them our allies such as Great Britain and France and Russia, we were giving them supplies and munitions and anything that they really needed to help them win. So were we really staying neutral? What do you guys think of that? Do you really think that the United States had remained neutral in this situation, even though we were giving aid to Great Britain and France and Russia? What do you guys think? I completely agree. I think this kind of takes us out of, neutrality there for a little bit. So if we're giving aid to people that, to a particular side, then we've chosen our side, right? We've chosen which side of the war we want to be on. And it exactly like you said, it takes us out of neutrality. It takes us into a particular side of the war that, the public didn't really want us to be on, and what Woodrow Wilson really didn't want us to be on. So we'll move on. However, and we'll talk about this more in our next lesson, we are forced to enter the war. And I say that very much as like with emphasis. So again, we were remaining sort of neutral. We were giving supplies to Great Britain and France and Russia. However, there was a ship called the Lusitania, and it was off the coast of Ireland, and a German U-boat. It was a British cruiser ship. It wasn't even a battleship or anything like that. It was similar. It was kind of like a British version of the Titanic almost. It was sank by a German U-boat. And the reason that this is important is because there were American citizens on board, and because of that, later on, we're forced to. This kind of shows Germany's hand. Prior to this, we had a kind of naval agreement with Germany in which they were restricting their submarine action and submarine military action in this particular area of water. And Germany broke that. They sank the Lusitania with a German U-boat. And, that's something obviously that, and again, we'll talk about this more in detail in our next lesson, but, we're not happy about it as a country, obviously our President Woodrow Wilson is not happy about it. And it's something that's really going to force our hand later on in the war. The next thing is what we call the Zimmerman telegram. So what actually happened with this is that this is a message from Germany to Mexico saying that if Mexico helped Germany invade the United States, then Germany would give Mexico a portion of the land. I believe it was Texas and Arizona in that area in which Mexico had lost to the United States in a prior war. We'll talk about this in greater detail later on. It was intercepted. It was never meant for us to find. However, whenever we found this message, it was kind of a tipping point for the United States, for the public opinion, for President Wilson. And it was very much just something that, took us over our breaking point. And eventually it will cause us to enter the war. And again, we'll talk about this later. We'll talk about this in way more detail in our next lesson, but I wanted to go ahead and give us kind of a sneak peek in what we're going to be talking about next. Okay, so that's it for the PowerPoint. So the last thing that I have for us today is the assignment for you guys. So I developed this worksheet, and whether you do have a little bit of time, so you can turn this into me today if you would like to, or you can turn it into me next class tomorrow, whatever you would like. So all I really want for you guys to do is, as we talked about today, how World War I made an impact on the world, how World War I impacted the United States, and how the Woodrow Wilson presidency impacted the United States. So all I really want you guys to do today for this assignment, for this worksheet, is I want you to give me 3 reasons why you think World War I impacted the world. I want you to identify them and explain them. Again, we went into detail with them today, so this should be fairly easy. If you have any questions, you can ask me about that. So that's the first part. I just want you to give me 3 reasons and explain them. It doesn't have to go into too much detail, but I just want to make sure that you guys understood the topic, understood the questions, and that way, again, it's just something for me to gauge where you guys are at and just see where maybe I need to go over things in the next lesson, things like that. So then the second part is I want to see you guys identify and explain 3 reasons on how the Woodrow Wilson presidency played a role in the United States and how it impacted the United States' view on World War I. So like we talked about, things like neutrality, things like public opinion, and even like the Lusitania and things like that. I'll let you guys put that in here. I know that's something that I said we talk about later on, but I think that this should be pretty easy for you guys. Again, we talked about it today. If you do have any questions, please just let me know, and I'd be more than glad to help. You guys do have a little bit of time today to be able to get this done. You can turn it into me today. However, if you don't get it finished, that's okay. You can turn it into me tomorrow, but I would like for it to be done by tomorrow if possible. So I believe that's all I've got for you guys today. I really enjoyed teaching the class. Does anybody have any questions? Anything? No? Okay, that's perfectly fine. If you guys don't have any questions, then that's all we're going to be doing for today. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. All right, see ya.